Mafia Boss paid $1 million for a lemonade stand, the reason why will break your heart. Massimo Bellini did not walk, he moved like a storm front, silent, heavy, and inevitable. As he stepped out of the black SUV, the humid air of Palermo seemed to chill. His perfectly tailored black suit resisted the dust of the street, a sharp contrast to the decaying buildings that lined the docks. For 2 decades, the name Bellini had been synonymous with a cold, surgical efficiency. He was a man of logic, a grandmaster who viewed the sprawling, chaotic city as nothing more than a mahogany chessboard where every citizen was a pawn to be sacrificed or a knight to be deployed. His reputation was built on a foundation of silence. In the underworld, they whispered that Massimo hadn't smiled since the day he buried his father, and perhaps even longer. His dark eyes, sharp and unreadable, never lingered on a face for more than a second. Just long enough to identify a threat or a debt. To the merchants in the plaza, he was a ghost that collected their peace of mind. To his rivals, he was a machine that calculated their downfall while they were still celebrating their victories. He lived by a singular, rigid philosophy: emotion is a leak in the hull of a ship, and eventually, it will sink you. As he adjusted his silk cuffs, his bodyguards formed a human wall around him, their hands hovering near their holsters. They were used to this version of Massimo, the Iron Boss, who could order a hostile takeover of a shipping empire without looking up from his espresso. He was a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. His life was a series of transactions, devoid of color, filtered through the lens of power and control. But as he moved toward the sidewalk, his polished shoes crunching on the grit of the pavement, the mechanical rhythm of his day faltered. Usually, people fled his path like shadows retreating from a flame. Yet, there stood a small, wooden crate. It was rickety, painted in a bright, defiant yellow that felt like an insult to the gray gloom of the district. Behind it stood Mirella, her braids slightly frayed, her brown eyes lacking the fear that usually greeted him. Massimo paused. The air around him, usually filled with the scent of expensive tobacco and ozone, suddenly carried the faint, sharp tang of freshly cut lemons. It was a smell that didn't belong in his world of gunpowder and grease. For the first time in 20 years, the Grandmaster found himself staring at a piece on the board he hadn't accounted for, a tiny, sun-drenched obstacle that didn't care about his reputation, his power, or the iron walls he had built around his heart. Massimo reached out, his large, calloused hand dwarfing the small paper cup Mirella held out to him. His bodyguards exchanged uneasy glances. They were trained to check every drink for poison, to scan every crowd for a glint of steel. But Massimo waved them back with a sharp flick of his wrist. He brought the cup to his lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The liquid was ice-cold, sharp with citrus and heavy with unrefined sugar. As the sour-sweet sting hit the back of his throat, the sounds of the Palermo docks faded into a haunting silence. The smell of expensive leather and exhaust vanished, replaced by the suffocating scent of damp concrete and rot. Suddenly, he wasn't 42, he was 12 years old, huddled in a windowless basement apartment in the slums of Naples. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He saw his younger sister, Lucia, lying on a thin mat on the floor. Her face, once as bright and hopeful as Mirella's, was gaunt and glistening with sweat. He remembered the way her small hand had clutched his shirt, her voice a dry rasp as she begged for something, anything, to take the heat away. In that memory, Massimo had run to the corner store with 3 crumpled coins he'd stolen from a neighbor's porch. He had bought a single lemon and a spoonful of sugar, stirring them into a cup of lukewarm tap water. He had held her head up, whispering that it was magic medicine, that it would make her better. Lucia had smiled at him. A weak, beautiful smile, and told him it was the best thing she had ever tasted. But magic hadn't been enough. In the slums, poverty was a terminal condition. Lucia had died 3 days later because their mother couldn't afford a doctor's visit, let alone the medicine to break the fever. Massimo had stood over her small, pine coffin and made a silent, terrifying vow: he would become so powerful, so rich, and so cold that the world could never take anything from him again. He had built his empire on the ashes of that grief, convinced that by becoming a monster, he was protecting the boy he used to be. Massimo blinked, the bright Sicilian sun burning his eyes. He looked down at the empty paper cup in his hand, then back at Mirella. The scar along his jawline tightened. The Iron Boss was still standing on that street corner, but for the first time in 3 decades, the ice in his veins was beginning to crack. The lemonade didn't taste like a 50-cent drink. It tasted like a debt he had been trying to pay for 30 years. Massimo crushed the empty paper cup in his fist, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet street. His men shifted, sensing a change in the atmosphere, but Massimo remained anchored to the spot. He looked at Mirella, really looked at her, seeing the frayed edges of her sleeves and the way she stood tall despite the exhaustion behind her eyes. "The lemonade is good," Massimo said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the humid air. "But a girl with your spirit doesn't stand in this heat for 50 cents a cup. What are you really selling, Mirella?" The girl didn't flinch at the weight of his gaze. She reached under the wooden crate and pulled out a small, tattered notebook. Its pages were filled with columns of numbers, hand-drawn graphs, and messy calculations. She flipped to the final page, where a single number was circled in bright red ink, $1 million. "I'm not saving for a doll or a new dress, signore," she said, her voice steady with a maturity that made Massimo's chest ache. "My papa is in the hospital. The doctors say his heart is tired. They say he needs a new one, but the surgery costs more money than there is in the whole world. The bank told Mama that we aren't a good investment. So, I decided I would make the money myself." Massimo stared at the red number in the notebook. $1 million. To him, it was a rounding error, a single shipment, a bribe paid to a silent official. To this child, it was an impossible mountain she was trying to move one pebble at a time. $1 million, Massimo repeated, his eyes darkening. "And how much have you made today, little one?" Mirella reached into a small tin can on the table and pulled out a handful of coins and a few crumpled bills. $12.50, she said with quiet pride. "It's more than yesterday. If I stay out until dark every day for the next 100 years, I think I can save him." The absurdity of the statement should have made Massimo laugh, but instead, it felt like a serrated blade was twisting in his gut. He thought of the bankers who had turned her mother away, men in suits just like his, men who calculated life and death on spreadsheets. They had looked at this family and seen a bad debt. Massimo looked at Mirella and saw the only thing in Palermo that wasn't for sale. Pure, unfiltered love. The Iron Boss looked back at the armored SUVs, the symbols of his cold, transactional world. Then he looked at the girl who was willing to stand in the sun for a century to save a life. The chess board was gone. The investment was clear. "You're right, Mirella," Massimo whispered, his voice sounding different even to his own ears. "The bank was wrong. You are the best investment in this city." Massimo leaned against the brick wall of the alleyway, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the small lemonade stand. He watched as Mirella straightened her stacks of napkins with a precision that mirrored his own disciplined life. "Tell me about these men in suits," he prompted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "The ones at the bank." Mirella's hands faltered for the first time. She looked down at the wooden crate, her braids casting shadows over her eyes. "Mama took me with her," she began, her voice small but clear. "She wore her only good dress, the one with the yellow flowers. She had all the medical papers in a neat folder. We waited for 3 hours in a room that smelled like expensive floor wax." She looked up at Massimo, and for a fleeting second, the innocence in her eyes was replaced by a haunting, adult recognition of cruelty. A man with a gold pen and a shiny silk tie sat behind a desk that was bigger than our kitchen table. He didn't even look at the medical reports. He just looked at Mama's shoes. Then he looked at the address of our apartment. Massimo's jaw tightened. He knew that look. It was the gaze of a man who measured the world in zip codes and credit scores, a man who saw poverty as a character flaw rather than a circumstance. He laughed. "Signore," Mirella whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Not a loud laugh, but a quiet one, like we were telling a joke he'd heard before. He told Mama that giving a loan to someone like her for a heart like Papa's was like throwing money into the sea. He said some lives aren't worth the risk of the investment. The silence that followed was suffocating. In the distance, the sirens of Palermo wailed, but here, the air was thick with the weight of Mirella's words. Massimo felt a familiar, cold rage beginning to boil in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't the hot, impulsive anger of his youth, but the calculated, lethal fury of the Iron Boss. He thought of the banks he owned, the boardrooms where he sat, and the men in suits, who bowed to him every day. They were the same men who had deemed this child's father a bad risk. To them, a human heart was just a line item on a balance sheet. To them, the costas were invisible. They said his life wasn't worth the risk, Massimo repeated, the words tasting like ash. He reached out and gently tucked a stray hair behind Mirella's ear. His hand was steady, but his mind was already miles away, navigating a different kind of chessboard. They made a mistake, Mirella. A very expensive mistake. He stood up, his height blocking out the sun, turning the street corner into a place of sudden, dark sanctuary. The Iron Boss was no longer just a spectator in this girl's tragedy, he was about to become the storm that would level the bank that had dared to laugh at her. Massimo stood tall, his silhouette blocking the harsh afternoon sun, casting a long, protective shadow over Mirella's small frame. The street, usually buzzing with the distant sounds of the city, seemed to fall into a vacuum of silence. His lead bodyguard, Dante, took a step forward, his hand twitching near his holster. He had seen Massimo by hotels, private islands, and the silence of high-ranking officials, but the look on his boss's face right now was more intense than any billion-euro merger. Without breaking eye contact with Mirella, Massimo reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal gray blazer. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound checkbook and a fountain pen that shimmered like dark water. The gold nib scratched against the paper. A rhythmic, decisive sound that felt like a sentence being handed down in a high court. "Signore," Dante whispered, his voice laced with confusion. "We have a meeting with the port authorities in 10 minutes. We should move." Massimo ignored him. He finished writing, tore the slip of paper with a sharp, crisp snap, and laid it gently on the rough wood of the lemonade stand. It rested right next to the tin can filled with nickels and dimes. Mirella looked down. Her eyes widened, her small mouth parting in a silent gasp as she counted the zeros. 1, 6, 7. The number was so large it didn't look like money, it looked like a miracle written in ink. "This isn't for a glass of lemonade, Mirella," Massimo said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone that carried the weight of an oath. "I am buying the stand. I am buying the crate, the pitcher, the lemons, and the dirt beneath your fingernails. I am buying every minute of the 100 years you were planning to stand here." 1 million, she stammered, her small fingers trembling as they touched the edge of the check. "But, why?" Massimo knelt, his expensive trousers pressing into the grit of the sidewalk so he could look her in the eye. For the first time, the Iron Boss didn't look like a predator. He looked like a man who had finally found a way to win a game he had lost decades ago. "Because the men in suits were wrong," he whispered. "Your father's life is the only investment in this city that actually matters. And I don't like it when people tell me what something is worth." He stood up and turned to his men. Their faces were masks of shock, their professional stoicism shattered by the sheer absurdity of the act. Massimo didn't care. He looked at the rickety yellow stand and then at the black armored cars waiting like predatory sharks in the street. "Dante, put the crate in the trunk," Massimo ordered. "And call the director of the Mediterranean Heart Institute." Tell him I'm coming, and tell him to clear a surgical suite. If he asks why, tell him I've just closed the most important deal of my life. The Mediterranean Heart Institute was a temple of glass and white marble, a place where life was whispered about in hushed tones and death was managed by bureaucratic committees. That silence was shattered when the heavy glass doors hissed open and Massimo Bellini marched in. He didn't look like a visitor, he looked like an occupying force. Behind him, 4 men in dark suits moved in a phalanx, their presence turning the sterile lobby into a war room. The receptionist, a woman used to dealing with the city's elite, began to offer a practiced, professional smile. It died on her lips the moment she met Massimo's eyes. There was no warmth there, only the cold, hard edge of a man who had spent his life breaking things that refused to bend. I am here for Morelos Costa, Massimo stated, his voice echoing off the high ceilings like a gavel strike. Sir, visiting hours are. I am not a visitor, Massimo interrupted, leaning over the desk until the woman instinctively recoiled. And I am not here to hold a hand. I want the board of directors. All of them. In this lobby. Now. The board is in a private budget session, signore. They cannot be disturbed for. Massimo didn't wait for her to finish. He turned to Dante, who was already holding a cell phone. Within seconds, the hospital's internal lines began to ring simultaneously. This was Massimo's version of a hostile takeover. He hadn't just brought a check, he had brought the weight of his influence, the debts owed to him by the city's politicians, and the terrifying reality of his displeasure. 10 minutes later, the elevators opened. 6 men and 2 women in expensive white coats and tailored blazers emerged, their faces a mixture of indignation and burgeoning fear. They had recognized the name Bellini. The chairman, a man whose silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses screamed of old money and misplaced ego, stepped forward. Mr. Bellini, this is highly irregular. We were discussing the fiscal years. You were discussing numbers, Massimo said, stepping into the chairman's personal space until the older man had to tilt his head back. I am here to discuss a heart. A heart you decided wasn't worth the fiscal risk of a loan. A heart belonging to a man whose daughter has more honor in her pinky finger than this entire board has in its collective soul. Massimo reached into his pocket and produced a copy of the $1 million check, slapping it onto the marble reception desk. The bill is paid. The risk is gone. Now, you will take your best surgeons, you will go to the ward where Morelos Costa is waiting, and you will save his life. You will not check your watches. You will not discuss insurance. You will simply do the job you were too cowardly to do when a mother came to you begging for help. The chairman looked at the check, then at the lethal stillness of the man standing before him. He realized in that moment that he wasn't looking at a donor. He was looking at his new owner. Get the surgical team ready, the chairman whispered to his assistant, his voice trembling. Good, Massimo said, his eyes narrowing. And stay close. I'm staying in this lobby until the lights in the OR go out. If they stay on too long, we'll have a very different conversation about this hospital's future. The sterile, white-tiled hallway of the Mediterranean Heart Institute felt more like a courtroom than a hospital as Massimo Bellini paced its length. He didn't look like a man waiting for news, he looked like a predator waiting for a confession. The board of directors stood huddled near the nurses' station, their collective breath hitched as they watched the Iron Boss stop in front of the chairman. I've been looking at your hospital's charity records while we wait, Massimo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the windows. He held up a smartphone, his thumb hovering over a file sent by his analysts. It seems you've denied 34 life-saving procedures in the last quarter alone. All cited as insufficient collateral. All families from the same zip code as Mirella Costa. The chairman wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip, his gold-rimmed glasses slipping. Mr. Bellini, those are complex fiscal decisions. We have a responsibility to the. You have a responsibility to the pulse, Massimo snapped, stepping so close that the chairman could see the faint, jagged scar along his jawline. In my world, if I take something, I pay for it. In your world, you take hope and you offer a spreadsheet. That ends tonight. Consider this a hostile audit. Massimo turned to Dante, who pulled a heavy leather briefcase from his side. Inside this case are the deeds to the 3 properties this hospital occupies. My shell companies purchased the land an hour ago. As of right now, I am not just a concerned citizen. I am your landlord. The board members gasped, a wave of visible panic rippling through the group. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been demolished. Here is the new protocol, Massimo continued, his eyes as cold as the surgical steel inside the ore. Every one of those 34 families will be contacted by morning. Their surgeries will be scheduled, and their debts will be wiped. If I see one more insufficient collateral report, I will exercise the clause in your lease that allows for immediate eviction. I will turn this marble palace into a warehouse for my shipping crates before the sun sets tomorrow. He leaned in, his shadow engulfing the chairman. You wanted to talk about risk? The only risk in this building right now is you. Now, get back into that observation room and make sure the surgeons don't lose their focus. If Morelos Costa doesn't walk out of here, neither do you. The administrators scrambled, their polished shoes squeaking on the linoleum as they fled toward the surgical wing. Massimo watched them go, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. For the first time in his life, he wasn't using fear to build a throne, he was using it to build a sanctuary. He walked back to the waiting room, where a 9-year-old girl sat clutching a tattered notebook, unaware that the most feared man in Italy had just declared war on the very concept of no. The high-tension atmosphere of the surgical wing felt strangely distant in the small, quiet corner of the waiting room where Massimo now sat. The Iron Boss, a man who usually occupied throne-like leather chairs in mahogany offices, looked out of place in the plastic, bucket-style seating of the hospital. His broad shoulders touched the edges of the frame, yet he didn't move. Beside him, Mirella was a blur of small, rhythmic motions. Her head was bowed in concentration as her tiny fingers worked a series of neon-colored threads, looping and knotting them with the same intensity she had shown at her lemonade stand. For 3 hours, they sat in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that some things were too important for small talk. Massimo watched her, his sharp dark eyes softening as he realized he was seeing something more valuable than any shipment he'd ever secured. He saw hope that hadn't been bought, only nurtured. It's almost done, Mirella whispered, not looking up. The colors, yellow for the lemons, and blue for the sky. It's for my papa, but I think I want you to have it. Massimo looked at his left wrist. Strapped there was a custom Patek Philippe, a masterpiece of platinum and sapphire glass worth more than a luxury villa on Lake Como. It was a tool for a man who lived by the second, a man who believed time was money and nothing else. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled the heavy metal band and slid the watch into his pocket. A fair trade, Massimo said, his voice unusually thick. He held out his bare wrist, the faint scar from his past visible in the harsh fluorescent light. Mirella reached out and tied the flimsy, braided string around his arm. The neon threads looked absurd against his expensive silk cuff, a splash of childhood innocence on a canvas of charcoal gray power. But as she double-knotted the string, Massimo felt a weight lift that his platinum watch had never been able to measure. Why would you trade that shiny clock for this? She asked, her brown eyes searching his. Mine is just string. Massimo looked at the bracelet, then at the girl who had dared to dream of $1 million. Because that watch only told me how much time I had left to be alone, he whispered. This reminds me why I'm here. In my world, Mirella, we call this the best investment I've ever made. Just then, the double doors of the surgical suite swung open. A surgeon, still masked and splattered with the evidence of a hard-won battle, stepped out. He looked at the Mafia Boss and the little girl, then slowly lowered his mask to reveal a weary, triumphant smile. Massimo didn't need to hear the words, he felt the investment pay off in the sudden, joyous sob that escaped Mirella's throat. The news of the $1 million lemonade stand rippled through the dark veins of Palermo faster than a police siren. In the smoke-filled backrooms of private clubs and the fortified villas of the hills, the capos of rival families whispered Massimo Bellini's name with a mixture of mockery and genuine alarm. To them, the Iron Boss had finally rusted. They saw a man who had traded his terrifying logic for the whims of a child, a king who had abandoned his throne to play saint in a hospital lobby. They joked that Massimo had grown soft, that his silk suits were now stained with sugar and sentiment. But while the lions snickered, the streets began to hum a different tune. In the markets of Bolaro and the crowded tenements of the docks, the story of Mirella Costa wasn't a joke, it was a revolution. For decades, these people had lived under the shadow of the Bellini name, fearing the heavy tread of his boots and the cold calculation of his taxes. Now, they spoke of the man who had humbled the arrogant bankers and broken the hospital board. They saw the neon-colored string around his wrist as a new kind of banner. Massimo hadn't just saved a father, he had challenged the very systems that kept the poor invisible. The balance of power began to shift in ways the other families hadn't anticipated. Information, the lifeblood of the underworld, started flowing to Massimo not through threats, but through gratitude. The grandmothers in the windows and the shopkeepers on the corners, usually silent and fearful, now acted as his eyes and ears. When a rival family tried to move against one of Massimo's territories, they found themselves met with a wall of community silence. No one would sell them bread, no one would tell them which way the target had run. Massimo noticed the change during his evening walk. Usually, the streets cleared when his black sedan approached. Now, men tipped their caps. Women nodded with a quiet, fierce respect. He realized that fear could build a wall, but hope could build a fortress. His rivals thought he was losing his grip on the city, but in reality, he was finally taking root in its soil. By the time Morelos Costa took his first steps out of the hospital, Massimo Bellini was no longer just the boss of a crime family. He had become something far more dangerous to his enemies, a folk hero. He had learned that the most powerful currency in Italy wasn't the euro or the bullet, it was the loyalty of a people who finally felt seen. The Iron Boss hadn't gone mad, he had simply realized that $1 million was a small price to pay to own the heart of the city. The corner of Via Roma was no longer a place of gray shadows and whispered deaths. Years had passed, and the salt air of Palermo had weathered the stones of the old neighborhood, but the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. Where a rickety wooden crate once stood, there was now a modest, sun-drenched community center built of warm Sicilian stone. Above the door, a brass plaque caught the light, bearing a simple engraving, the Mirella Costa Foundation. Inside, the halls hummed with the sound of children, the sons and daughters of dockworkers and flower sellers, studying for exams that would take them to universities that men in suits had once deemed out of their reach. It wasn't just a school. It was a factory for dreams, funded by the Iron Boss, who had traded his cold chess board for a legacy of living, breathing potential. Massimo Bellini stood on the sidewalk across the street, his hair now salted with gray, his black suit still perfectly tailored but worn with a different kind of ease. He no longer felt the need to scan every rooftop for a sniper, the neighborhood itself was his shield. He looked down at his left wrist. The Patek Philippe was back in its velvet box at home. In its place, tucked subtly under his silk cuff, was a frayed, faded braid of neon-colored string, now reinforced with a thin gold wire to keep it from ever breaking. Mirella, now a confident young woman finishing her medical degree, stepped out of the center and waved. Her father, Morelos, stood beside her, his gait strong and his heart beating with a rhythm that Massimo had personally underwritten. They didn't bow in fear as the city once had, they smiled with the warmth of family. Massimo realized then that his rivals had been wrong to think he had lost his mind that sweltering Thursday afternoon. For decades, he had believed that owning the city meant controlling its fear, but he had been a prisoner of his own empire, locked in a cycle of vengeance and cold transactions. He had lived a life of having, but he had never truly owned anything until he gave it away. The $1 million hadn't been a payment for a drink or even a surgery. It had been the ransom for his own soul. As he watched Mirella walk toward him, Massimo felt a quiet, profound peace. He had spent 40 years building a mountain of power, only to realize that the view was much better from the ground, standing next to a girl who knew that some things are worth everything you have. The Iron Boss was gone. In his place stood a man who finally understood that the most successful, hostile takeover in history was the one a 9-year-old girl had staged on his heart.